I'm from the shadows, left the gallows, made the summit. Hear the trumpets rolling in like it's 300. Left the battle, the ravage, protecting, and we set the bodies up.
If anybody watching this has already played Rust, they've probably also experienced the same pain I have in not literally being able to play anymore because every server has a freaking queue. Mostly because, as of right now, the game is kind of exploding. But it's definitely exciting to see this game blow up out of nowhere, especially considering it's one of my favorite games of all time. But while everyone has known Rust for years, why in the world is it just now shining into mainstream light? And not just answer that simple question, but go through the ups, downs, and potential future of the game. But anyway, guys, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. December 11th, 2013. This date marks the start of a new survival game, Rust, a primitive survival MMO, a survival game where a player starts off with just a rock and a torch, and can build up shelters to eventually amount to even guns. However, as you build a base and get lots of loot, other players can build up expensive explosive resources in large quantities and destroy bases, taking all of their loot. The game would later amount to 1 million consistent viewers on Twitch, but the game started pretty small, and there's a good reason it took so long for it to blow up. Rust originally took heavy inspiration from the DayZ mod. Some might even say they copied it, because they replicated many core elements, like having zombie NPCs roam the map along with the main antagonists of the game, which are other humans. Rust was multiplayer only, and while you tried to survive, many other people were trying to do the same. And a lot of the time, the players are more than happy to steal from you and harm you just for their own gain. The original version of Rust had almost a completely different art style than modern Rust, and we're going to refer to this first style of the game as Legacy Rust. Legacy ran from 2013 to 2014 and could be considered the real alpha of the game, as while the core elements of the game remain like building, surviving, shooting, and many others, almost everything we know about each element has been completely changed. For example, now players build using building plans and hammers, a more condensed way to place walls and other things using one item, while before every single part of a base had to be purchased separately. Rust, while never seen as an all-time great, didn't have a traditional set of rises and falls, but rather started off with a pretty successful player base of around 50,000. And this could possibly be credited to Facepunch's very successful Garry's mod, a game blowing up right before the release of Rust, leading to the stigma we see in many companies known as game reliability. Rust and many other games produced by big corporations probably wouldn't have ended up starting out as successful as they were if it wasn't for this mindset of reliability. It's something I'm sure you've seen in things like movie advertisements. When a new movie is released by a company responsible of a previous hit success, often in the trailer they tell you brought to you by the same people of these other movies you love to automatically make you think the new movie will be of that same caliber. If someone were to play Garry's mod and absolutely love it, no matter what the game is, you've already won that player over, as they already know who you are and know that you have the ability to produce a good title. And while Gmod took a while to gain traction, Rust started with a large audience. However, as the hype died down from the start, we began to see Rust immediately fall from that 50,000 consistent player base to about 10,000 at its very low. As sure, anyone can get their previous fanbase to try a game, however getting them to stay is no easy task, and Rust was already by 2014 beginning to die. What was wrong with Rust? Why didn't the original player base stay? Well, Rust, if we're being honest, in Legacy definitely struck as lazy and unoriginal. I've never played Legacy myself, so it's really hard to give an opinion, as a lot of videos on YouTube actually defend the original version. However, I honestly feel like that is just the player living the nostalgia of the game. A couple weeks ago, SunnyV2 released a video talking about why Minecraft was so nostalgic, and brought up many good points that fit with Rust just as well, being that many people automatically feel like the old, more simplistic versions of a game were way better, but it's only because that sense of nostalgia makes memories seem even better than they actually were, and a lot of the time no one even realizes how much better the game has came over time. There was one map One player model, less ways to raid, a much smaller skill gap, and overall just less to do, which is definitely much worse than modern Rust, no matter the memories that Legacy gave. Sure, this all meant the game was more user-friendly, but at the end of the day, there were already established survival games that just did everything Legacy Rust did, but better. However, I'm referring to this old time as Legacy Rust for a very important reason, because in the later half of 2014, Facepunch decided to introduce the modern, brand new Rust we know today, known as Rust Experimental. Experimental Rust was basically taking all of Legacy Rust issues and making them 10 times better. Experimental brought brand new randomly generated maps, new player models for every account, massive learning curves, and improved game mechanics from Legacy. With this new change, guns were changed forever, and rather than the traditional first-person shooter style of guns seen in Legacy, Experimental brought specific recoil patterns for each gun, which made every gun unbelievably difficult to use, however made them all so much more rewarding. And the best players in the game aren't measured by just their strategic ability in fights, but also how well they can fire, as even the best ever in the game still haven't perfected these recoil patterns to where they can be accurate every time. Rust saw a new form of building and collecting resources. Previously, the player would have to purchase parts for their home, but as described earlier, this new update brought in a building plan that would be required to build and would give the player access to every type of building, along with the introduction of the tool cupboard. Debatedly one of the best changes to ever come into Rust. As anyone who didn't know what Legacy Rust was before, they probably never even realized that Rust could be played without a TC, but it actually used to be. As you guys may know, in Rust, a tool cupboard acts like the town hall to your base, and anyone with access to it can build, place, pick up, and demolish buildings in and around the base, meaning it was most of the time the most protected part of your base, and if somebody were to say blow into your house and take the TC, the base would pretty much become theirs and they would have all your loot. This change not only made raiding more fun, but fixed some of Rust's biggest issues, as previously when there were no TCs, if you placed anything, a wall, furnace, box, it could never be picked up again, and any mistakes you made were permanent, which for obvious reasons was an absolutely essential change, as just placing a wall wrong could completely ruin your base, and the only way to get it back would be to raid it yourself. Besides even just gameplay changes, just look side to side, Legacy versus Experimental, and look how clunky and gross looking Legacy looks compared to the butter smooth, beautiful environment in Experimental. Even though it is looked back on as a controversial statement now, back then the change was more than welcome, as Facepunch made both versions available to the player, and even though the game began to revive itself, doubling its player base, it was all players jumping into the more advanced Experimental Rust experience, and by 2015, Legacy was fully dead as it was finally removed from Rust in general. From 2015 to 2018, we see what we can describe simply as the slow rise for Rust. During these events, mostly small updates and gameplay improvements were introduced. This consistent rise in Rust can possibly be explained by the build-up in community. Rust YouTubers are some of the most hard-working content creators, and with resources like cinematic menus, the content creators build multi-hour long movies of the stories that connected with everybody watching. These little videos show off a whole entire story between multiple players, and no matter what happens, each viewer can relate to being in very similar situations, and understand the grief or excitement the content creator would feel in certain scenarios. Not to mention, they're pretty noob friendly. A large number of Rust players I know discovered the game from the YouTube scene, and after seeing how fun and exciting the stories looked, they wanted to experience that firsthand. I wouldn't put all the credit towards content creators, as Rust was consistently updating the game, mostly for the better, and put tons of passion into producing better content, but almost always a good community will directly lead to a long-lasting game, and that's more evident here than ever. But anyway, back onto the timeline. Rust was living and lasting quite well in its alpha/beta, but in 2018, it was officially released as a final game. The changes in this game were very significant, including an overhaul in graphics and a decrease in update frequency from weekly to monthly, which sounds like a negative, but it's actually pretty normal in a game when finally releasing, as they are no longer trying to build a final game, but trying to improve an already finished one. And rather than experimenting within the game, they would instead open up a testing branch for the more serious fans to go try out potential new updates to get feedback, ensuring that any release onto the main game was well tested and optimized. And by release, 60,000 players became 80, 80 became 100, and 100 became a 250,000? What in the world happened here? 100,000 players was the biggest Rust has ever been. Sure, Rust was peaking, but then not only did they rise to a higher peak, but the peak was well over double the month previous. So what happened? Well, let me introduce you to something called the OTV Content Creator Server, a map that wouldn't be public and would just include content creators. I credited a lot of Rust's success on the community around it, but while the YouTube community was at its peak, the Twitch community could barely rack 10,000 consistent viewers. But what if somebody were to reach out to each of the biggest streamers on Twitch and expose over 1 million people to this brand new game? What if? Well, there's a reason I'm telling you this, because that is exactly what happened. XQC, Myth, Critical, Pokimane, Valkyrie, Jacksepticeye, every single popular Rust creator, Stevie, Blueprint, Mimeo, H-June, everyone was playing it, and Rust went from around 10,000 viewers to topping 1 million viewers, and ever since has been the biggest game on Twitch for over a week. Rust literally has been given its biggest chance ever. Every person who watches Twitch now knows what Rust is and has watched people try it. And not only that, but majority of the content creators loved the game, and while most people always knew what Rust was, it never got that mainstream light that it quite frankly deserved up until now. So Rust as of right now is the biggest it's ever been by an absolute landslide, but now that we're up to modern times, let's ask the question that everyone who loves Rust has wondered. Will it last? Many games get this mainstream light, but as we saw with Legacy Rust promoting from Gmod, even if a game is condoned by another popular source, it has to be one of the best games out there to stand on its own. And even though we saw the game sink once before back in 2013, I feel like the game will 100% without a doubt stick around. No game has ever managed 1 million viewers constantly, even Minecraft or Fortnite, but I'm not measuring whether Rust will stay at 250,000 players and 1 million viewers, but rather compare it to how it was before its blow up, and see if after all the mainstream hype dies down, if Rust still maintains above its original 100,000 player peak, which in my opinion will undoubtedly happen. Rust, despite its shaky start, has reinvented itself into an original, beautiful survival game that now competes with the top dogs like Horizon Zero Dawn and its main inspiration, DayZ. But no matter what happens with Rust, I think now is a better time than ever to go through its history and recap some of the ups and downs of this game and see how it got to this point after years of trial and error. Anyway guys, if you enjoyed, please make sure to like and subscribe, check out some of my other videos, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Peace out.